Amazing. We are live here with I'm gonna say it straight away, Kevin, one of my favorite content creators in the front end ecosystem. You've always just got such a lovely kind of way about you. You always really dive into some excellent detail. So I really could not be happier to have you here live with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's so nice of you. I'm glad you like my content. Hopefully, yeah, I can share a few other things today, but I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for, it's cool that you're having me. So I like that you started doing these live streams and stuff. It's a nice new thing you're up to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I actually started doing kind of a monthly kind of community hangout it was during COVID when we were all kind of locked indoors and everything, and started doing it, but then just kind of fell out of the habit, and now we're kind of restarting it and everything. So so yeah, it's really nice to get chatting to people and hopefully give the community a lot of really valuable information. So before we dive into questions from the community, and for anyone who's here kind of watching live as well, please do feel free to just start asking any CSS related questions that you've got for Kevin, and we'll get through as many as we can throughout the stream. But first of all, it would just be great to understand kind of your journey of getting into web development. Where did you start, and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so I took an unconventional path, I guess you could say. I never saw myself getting into web development. It was something I did as a hobby back in the late 90s when it was slicing up Photoshop designs and making websites from them with tables. So things were a little different back then. And it was more or less like this on again, off again hobby, where if I needed something, I would sort of catch up on whatever the newest stuff was after, 18 months of not touching it, and then get into it. The pace of change back then was also a lot slower.
Yeah.
And then after a few different degrees in unrelated things and jobs in unrelated things, I was working as a designer, and I had a really good job in terms of what I was learning on the job, but not in terms of pay. So I was doing freelance work on the side. And the freelance stuff I was doing on the side was primarily UI designs. And I was like, well, if they're going to pay me to design it, maybe they'll also pay me to develop it, and I can get more money. And so that's how I sort of I think it was around then that I realized that I actually like the development side better than the design side, and I'm better at it too. I'm a pretty mediocre designer. Uh, so that was sort of the beginning of me taking it more seriously and actually learning how to do things properly, and trying to figure out what was going on. And I was primarily doing WordPress development. I did a couple of my own custom themes and then realized I was wasting time and started getting into child themes. And that worked out really well for me. And I think was sort of how I really got into CSS now that I look back at it, because I would basically always have the same starting theme. You could add or remove certain little things from it, but I was just starting with the same theme, deleting the CSS file and coming in with a new one to make the design work. And it was a little bit like CSS Zen Garden style. So most of the work I was doing ended up being CSS stuff. So yeah, that's sort of how I got more into that world. And then when I had to learn it properly was when I got hired to be a teacher at my old design school, because they'd added a curriculum for web content, and me and one of the other new teachers were the only ones that had web experience. So we ended up teaching on that side of things. And that's when I sort of actually dove into understanding what was going on instead of just trying to hack things together.
Yeah. Nice. Well, I'm sure everyone in the chat will agree that you are a very, very good teacher of CSS and everything. So so that's great, and it's nice that you've kind of gone down the self-taught route yourself, and now you are teaching self-taught developers as well. It's a really nice way to go about it. Right. First question from the community. We would first of all just love to know kind of, obviously many variables. This is often it depends style answer, but what are the most common tools you reach for when you start a new project? These could be software, libraries, frameworks, preprocessors, or anything else that you love using when building stuff.
Yeah, so it does depend a little bit on the scope of the project.
Yeah.
If it's something that's going to be smaller, I still will just open up a blank folder and just sort of start hacking at it away from there with just whatever. These days I am using Astro a lot. I really enjoy using Astro, so that's probably where I would start from, even for smaller projects. And if possible for larger ones, as long as it fits with what I'm doing, which the type of content and the type of projects I work on, it fits really well. So Astro is definitely top of the list. In terms of CSS, that's where the scope can change a little bit. Where is it just writing regular vanilla CSS, or do I want to use something else? I don't really use any frameworks. Over the years, I've sort of developed my own system using Sass, where I'm generating a lot of stuff through maps and other things. So I have like a starting template that I'll bring in, and that just has everything, basic layouts are already there. A whole bunch of utility classes are already in there. Some other, things that I would reuse project to project. I have some navigation stuff set up, and then it has like a configuration file, so I can go in there and tweak the colors, the certain layout things and other stuff. And that gets the project started pretty quickly. Yeah. So it definitely sort of a custom solution that I've made myself, sort of developing over time, just with whatever I saw myself doing over and over again. So, and that's sort of how I like doing it, because I still like just writing CSS. So it still leaves that door opened with however I'm doing it. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a Kevin Powell CSS. Yeah, it's I've done it over the years, kind of as you read about new ways, whether it's methodologies or like you say, kind of build up your own SAS functions and things like this. Yeah, you kind of mesh together these little code snippets that actually you pull together, and it becomes your own configuration. It can become really powerful for your own workflow, because there is never any kind of right or wrong answer. It's just like what works best for you. And obviously, like you said, the scope of the project massively kind of impacts that as well. Nice. Also, when you're talking about kind of building projects, we always find it in Frontend Mentor when people are taking challenges and they start out with like newbie level challenges, and then they move through to kind of multi-page projects and a bit larger, quite a few different components in there and this kind of thing. What would you say? Do you have a preferred method for when you're organizing your CSS in larger projects? And also kind of why do you like that approach? Because maintainable, scalable CSS is very different to just a kind of tiny little component or project.
Yeah, it's much easier on the small ones when you sort of don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is definitely something that's changed a lot for me over the years. And I'm still always trying to figure out, is this the best way to be doing it? And changing my mind on stuff. So, my answer now will probably be different in 6 months from now. Mm-hmm. But so for like looking at bigger projects, as I said, I've been using Sass for a long time. So I was using partials. You don't need Sass for that. You can use post CSS as well, which is, just to sort of, you have all your different CSS files, but it'll bring everything into one final one. So it just lets you be more organized. You can have a utilities folder. You can have your components folder. You can have a general folder or a base folder. Like you separate everything, and then in there you have all the different files. So you could have, every utility has its own file, every component has its own file, and so on. All the layouts and stuff, and that just makes it easy, because if I'm looking for something in VS Code, Control P to open, search my component name or whatever, and I have my CSS for it. So that always worked well for me. As I said, these days I've been using Astro a lot, so I still have my partial system that I'll use. Again, this is for larger projects. So I still have that, but component stuff, I'm now just using scope styles, because then I have all my component stuff is there. So there's the HTML and anything you need there. Then you have the styles and the JavaScript all in one folder. So that sort of makes sense to me for components, because you look for your component, you find everything you need.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've started playing with more now, and I'm trying to figure out how to use it with how I work, is layers, cascade layers they were added to CSS, I think 2 years ago, but they're about 95% support now. So they're finally getting to that point where you can sort of go, okay, I can use these in production, and I wouldn't do it for a big project quite yet, but for side projects or other stuff. and I'm just trying to find. I've done it with a few small things just to experiment with, but I'm not really sure if I'm doing it in the best way. So I'm sort of waiting for people. There's a lot of smarter people out there, so I just wait until they figure it out, and then I copy what they did. And just for people who don't know layers, it's just a way of sort of organizing your own CSS within. You have like layers within your CSS file. So you could have a reset layer, and then you could have a base layer, and then a components layer or something like that, and a utilities layer. And the specificity of each layer is unique only to that layer. So you wouldn't do this, but if you had an ID in your reset layer, and then you have another layer after that, an element selector in the second one would actually overwrite the ID selector in the higher layer. So it potentially makes management of everything a little bit easier, because the whole specificity thing is more by what layer something's in, and then you have the scoped sort of specificity within each one. But at the same time, if you do it in a messy way, it could probably cause more problems. So it's one of those things I'm trying to still see how I might work with them.
Yeah, it seems, and actually that's a question. One of the first questions in the chat is kind of what's your take on the current state of layers in CSS? So that kind of goes into that, and it seems like a lot of the recent inclusions in CSS, whether it's kind of more powerful pseudo class selectors or the layers in CSS as well, kind of. A lot of it is around like addressing specificity concerns as well, and that has sort of specificity front of mind. So yeah, I'd love to hear. You've already touched on layers a bit, but yeah, what would you say kind of the current state of layers is in CSS? Would you be using it?
Yeah, so I do think they're getting to the point now where we can definitely think about using them, which is cool, and that's whenever there's sort of different types of features that can come out, but it's when these types of like layers, if it doesn't work, it just that CSS doesn't work in the browser. So if the support's low, you don't want to use it. So it's nice, like we're finally at the point now where we can start playing with it in bigger things and not just random code pens, which is cool. And the other thing that's kind of cool with it is you can even have like sub layers within layers and stuff. So I think from an organization point of view, it is going to be something we see used a lot more for very large projects. But even the nice thing with them, actually, if anyone just wants to experiment, like say the only things you really need, you have like a general reset, you just make a reset layer. Then you could have, like, if you're using any third-party tools, Bootstrap's always the common one that comes up, but you know, any third-party thing that you might be using, you could have a layer just for that brings in all of that CSS, because you can use imports with layers as well. So you can import that, and then anything that's not in a layer has the highest precedence. So it's going to overwrite all those layer stuff anyway. So you could bring in the third-party stuff, not even worry about the specificity they used in it, and then just have all of your stuff coming after that. I think that's going to be really common to see, just so you're not fighting against stuff and trying to figure out, you know, this framework did something weird that I'm having trouble overcoming. Or even if it's an old project and you're coming in, you know, I could see it being useful for that too. If you're coming up with a new system, or, you know, legacy projects and updating them is always a big pain. So if you just put all of the old code import through an individual layer, and then all the new stuff isn't in a layer, so you know it's going to have precedence when you need it to, and not get into these the stories I've heard of legacy project stuff, and some of the stuff I've seen is incredible. So to not have to worry about any of that, it's going to be pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, we one of my first roles in web development was in an agency, and the amount of kind of legacy code bases that you had to dive into, that immediately as you're saying that, I'm like, oh yeah, that would have been great here, that would have been great there. Yeah, I can definitely see that being a great use for it, for sure. Not a question, but Michaela's saying that she loves your t-shirt. You always have great t-shirts. I must say, you design them, right?
I had this one designed. I didn't do it myself. It's the same person, Christopher, who designed the state of CSS and state of JavaScript, the logos and t-shirts and stuff. So yeah, he did. I have the selectors on there.
Like it. That's amazing. Bill is asking, do you have a template for your CSS at all? Like, do you have kind of a sort of a repo or anything around it, or is that something that you sort of just keep?
I sort of keep it to myself in a way. Not because it's not something I would want to share, just because it's kind of, I don't think someone would be able to jump into it and actually start using it right away. Just and because I'm in sort of in a transition right now, and I'm trying to figure out ways of making content. I do have a course actually that I have called Beyond CSS that goes into a lot of detail, but part of the course isn't. I show how I do it, but I also the reason I did it as a course is because I don't want to just show how I do it. I want to give an understanding of how it works so people can make their own that works the way they want it to work, because I think that's the most important thing. And that's why I'm hesitant to sort of release exactly as I have it now, because it's really how I've done things for a long time, and it works really well for me. And I keep sort of tweaking and changing and pulling at stuff. So I'm not sure the best way to do it in a way that would actually be beneficial for people. But it is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I'll probably make a lighter weight version of it at one point, just so it's out there. But I'm not sure exactly yet what I would do.
That's cool. Yeah, because things can be in well, I mean, CSS is in a huge state of flux with all of the changes around it, and as you take kind of, as you, like we were saying earlier, kind of take new inspiration from different people and add new things. Yeah, you might not necessarily want people to take it at face value at that exact time, because it's sort of a malleable code base.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. This was a question that came in from the community in Discord. I'm planning on learning Tailwind soon. How would you decide whether to use a framework like Tailwind, a preprocessor, or plain old CSS?
So part of it's definitely the scope of the project. Part of it would be like Tailwind doesn't serve a purpose unless you're using some sort of JavaScript framework, because if you don't have something to create components, you're just going to be going kind of crazy repeating yourself with dozens of class names. Whereas if you can make it into a component, then it's sort of like having a class where you do it once and you can reuse that class. You can do it once and reuse your component. So that would play into it a little bit. And then it's, for me, personal preference as well. I like writing CSS. So for me, I'm probably going to go either plain CSS if it's smaller, or, as I said, I use Sass, so I'll use a preprocessor for something larger. And that's what I would do. But it also, it depends if you're working in a team. Obviously, you need to do what they want to do at the same time, and whatever else. But yeah, that's sort of...
Yeah, absolutely. Frameworks can definitely be useful, especially, like you said, kind of working in a team, and like having everyone writing similar code and being able to onboard people to the project faster is always a really good one. But like you said, with Tailwind, we're experimenting. So we've got an admin platform for Fundamental where we help kind of add content, like adding new challenges or articles or anything like that. We've done what everyone says that you shouldn't do, which is build our own CMS. But it's working for us. And actually, we've got a like Storybook component library. We were using, or we still are using, styled components, but with the way that everything's moving with Next.js, React Server components and everything like this as well, we're experimenting on the admin platform with potentially using Tailwind just to kind of see, like, reworking our Storybook library in Tailwind. And it's actually working really well at the moment. So yeah, it's kind of, you have to know why you're using something. If you're learning Tailwind just because everyone seems to be learning Tailwind, but you don't have a specific use case for it, like you said, if you're doing a project that is more suited to just plain old CSS, or using a preprocessor like Sass or Less or something like that, then if you're using Tailwind on that, then you might be using the wrong tool for the job, for sure. Next one. So CSS has evolved a lot recently, and it really has. It's been adding new features like nested CSS selectors, variables, kind of things like container queries, more powerful pseudo class selectors, and all this kind of thing. In many ways, it keeps moving closer to Sass or SCSS. Why would you choose Sass over plain old CSS these days? And also, do you ever kind of see them not necessarily gaining parity, but kind of getting close enough that you might think, like, actually Sass, there's not a huge need for it anymore?
Yeah. So once again, comes down to scale of the project a little bit and what you need. Because 100%, like if I just need nesting and variables, nesting and variables are more powerful within vanilla CSS these days, just because, especially variables, like that was one of those things where when we had variables in the preprocessors and then they're like, oh, we're getting variables in CSS now. That's cool. And then when it's like, oh, wait, these are live variables. They're not something that's pre-compiled. This is a live variable that the browser's looking at. That opened up a whole bunch of like new things and new possibilities that we couldn't do with preprocessor variables. We're seeing that with some of the other things that are coming now too, just because it's live in the browser. So I think on that front, like I use, even when I'm doing a SaaS project, I'm using CSS variables or custom properties within those projects still. So yeah, that definitely is a good question. If it's a smaller thing, then that's perfectly fine. For
Yeah.
me, when I start using them, sorry, my computer's going a little funky. For me, if I decide to use SaaS on something that's a bit larger in scale, it's usually because I want to use things like maps. I want to use custom functions. I want to use mix-ins and some other stuff. And I know there's a proposal now from Miriam Susan to bring mix-ins into regular CSS, but that's super early days, so it'd probably be a couple of years before it even gets to the spec, maybe at least a year, and then it's another 2 years before it actually makes it into like it's usable enough to use as production.
Yeah.
So I think it just depends, like, do you need the more advanced stuff? Loops can be super useful. I really like, again, it depends what you're doing, but it's kind of cool to be able to create a loop in CSS just to create a really large block. It's what I use it for a lot, is like I have a map of all my colors, so I can loop through that map to create custom properties and to create other things and create variations of those colors. And there's other things you can do with them. So for stuff like
Yeah.
that, I would still use SaaS. But if it's something, I see why people might say, you know what, I don't really need it. I have everything I need. The main things I was using were nesting and custom properties and partials. So then you probably don't need it. So it depends.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. A lot of the time, we get these kind of questions in our Discord a lot, and through the community a lot. And I always say, kind of just use the language itself until you're really starting to get some headaches with it, and you're like, I really need this. I really need to do this and this and this. But the language, and whether that's CSS or JavaScript or anything, like use the plain language when you're learning, especially like
Yes,
for
definitely. Yeah.
as long as you can, so you really get the fundamentals, you really get to know the language itself, and then you'll start to realize like, oh, I need SAS for kind of loops, functions, like all of this kind of thing now, and you have a very specific reason for using it. And same with JavaScript, and everyone wants to move to kind of React and things like this, like as soon as possible. But it's like, go with plain JavaScript, kind of really use that. And as you start to get to larger projects, you'll start to really feel the need of kind of why you need to use this thing and what benefits it brings as well, for sure.
Definitely. I will say one of my biggest pain points when I'm in regular CSS, especially because I'm teaching, is code comments, because the comments are always blocks in CSS, whereas SAS has single line comments. And so when if I comment out a whole bunch of code and then I'm like, I just want to uncomment that one line for a demo, it's a nightmare. CSS comments for like toggling on and off, I hate it. Yeah, that's like the one thing that drives me nuts.
That's funny that out of all of the CSS, is commenting. That's the thing that drives you nuts. Matthew is asking, would you be open to explaining your CSS folder structures in small or large scale projects, either here during the sit down or in a newsletter? So you don't necessarily need to dive into it too much. Or do you have any articles or anything that go into this at all?
I definitely have done a video on it in the past, probably a couple of years old now, I'm guessing. But my main breakdown is sort of just trying to make it like in a way that is organized, what makes sense for me. So it's really like I have my base styles or I have a reset, but actually it's in my base styles. So like base styles are just sort of like their general stuff, things on your body, all of that are reset. Then I have stuff for a folder for like type related things. I have a folder for utility classes. I have a folder for components. I have a folder for layouts. I have a folder for third party if ever I need it. I'm probably forgetting something along the way there, but I just try and sort of separate the different things from each other as much as possible. And it's one of those things that for me has even changed over time the more I'm doing stuff. So I just think, try coming up with something, like organizing it in a way that you feel makes sense for you, and then just seeing, once you've used it for a couple of projects, you start seeing like, oh, I should have done this differently, or should have done this, would make more sense, or whatever. And I think that's one thing that's important, whether you're getting something from somebody else or you're getting, usually that's a good place to start. Find an article online, start using that, but don't feel like you have to use it that way. If you see things that are bugging you where you're like, oh, this would make more sense, then do it that way, right? So like find systems that work for you or adapt them to what you need.
Yeah, exactly. The structure kind of sounds similar to like a SMAX
Exactly, yeah.
sort of architecture, and like that, I used a similar architecture, but then like you say, just you can customize it. You can be like, oh, I need this, like, or I don't quite like how they do this way, but I prefer to do it this way. And it's you sort of just take what you need from other people and just put your own spin on it for however improves your own workflow. We have next question from Raymond in the chat. How best can you judge the specific width of media queries of the screens, given the fact there are different media sizes? Which would you recommend? So I guess this is kind of a like adaptive versus responsive type question, like this kind of thing.
Yeah. One problem with media queries is they always feel very magic numbery, just because you sort of throw something at it. My main things are try and have as few as possible, and something you could use consistent. Like you don't want to have like, 600 for this one thing and then 525 for this other one and then 900, and like find like this is my small, my medium, my large, or whatever it is, and just know it's going to be general ranges. Like people, the Bootstrap numbers became really popular just because I think Bootstrap had put them and they I think matched the iOS devices or something or similar to them, but just find numbers that generally work for you. I usually say like, look where the layout is breaking. That's why the word breakpoint makes sense to me. But my layout, it's either too narrow or getting too wide. I'm going to create a media query that sort of solves that problem. Because the problem there too in deciding where breakpoint should be is it really is related to the design. And if you don't have sort of that design background or an eye for design, because that's not what you've studied, it can be hard to know when it's not looking good. But so much of it, the idea of a breakpoint is around the design, because like, what's the line length, or line length's getting too long? Well, maybe now I can put it down to, from 1 column to 3 columns, or is it getting way too squished? Okay, let's make it not be columns anymore and let's let them stack. So it's sort of finding numbers that work well for you. And one thing, it's good timing on it. I think it was last week I put out a video on it because I'd posted a video looking at a way to sort of do intrinsic style ones. So no media query involved. But you had a bunch of calcs that would sort of make the grid work. So it would go from 0 columns to 3 columns. But it's kind of, there's a few like little tricks that you have to do to get it to work. And the math on it's kind of weird. And then Miriam Suzanne had saw what I did and she actually replied on Mastodon, and she was using a calc inside the media query. And I was like, wait, you can do that? Or it was with a container query for hers. But then I was like, wait, can you do that with media queries? And it turns out you can. So what's really cool with doing it that way is you could say like, I want this column to change, or sorry, I want this layout to change. If I want it to be 3 columns when each column could be about 300 pixels wide. So you're not worried about like, what's the viewport size? You're actually thinking about like, what's the size of the column? So you go, okay, it's 3 columns. I can just do a calc 3 times 300 pixels. So it's 900. You can do the math in your head, but it's just like the fact that you can do that as a calc, and you don't have to use pixels. You can use ems or rems or ch or whatever, and you can have it adapt according more. It's sort of more about the content itself rather than like how big is my viewport. I thought that was really cool. So I've sort of been playing around with that a lot lately.
That's extremely cool. It's always nice when you find this a new little technique that you didn't know existed, and you just kind of start playing around with stuff and find new ways of doing things. Always lovely light bulb moments.
Yeah.
And I mean, this, I don't know what your answer might be to this, but like I've got a opinion on this as well, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So, what recent CSS additions do you think will most impact how we build interfaces? And mine kind of actually goes back to the last question as well a little bit, but go for it on yours.
Yeah. So coming, I guess for layout, it's sort of what we're leaning towards there. So I think I'd have to say container queries, just because then we're not looking at the size of the screen or the browser or whatever. We're looking at the room available for that element in whatever context it's living in. And that, especially we were talking about a little bit earlier, like everything is a component now with all the JavaScript frameworks and stuff. So
Yeah.
like it makes so much sense to say that like this thing, which could be 3 columns or 1 column, it's not about how big the viewport is, it's about its context. So if you put it in the sidebar, it's going to stack, even if it's a really wide screen. Or then I take it, I have that same component down somewhere else, and well, there it's going to be 3 columns because it has more room. And I don't have to be like, oh, I'm in the sidebar, so I have to write different code for that or something. Like it just works. That's really, really cool. And the other reason I think it's going to fundamentally change things is because with container queries, we also have style queries. They're they're not ready for production. They're only in Chrome or Chromium right now. And they're a bit limited in that you can only use them based on custom property values. But even then you can make like true false things and toggle stuff, which is really cool. Like you could do like theme light or theme dark and then just have the whole thing change based on one custom property. But eventually that's going to open up to be like, if the parent has a background of this color, I'm going to apply these styles to it. And it's, and then you can just plug that component wherever, and it's going to be styled based on the style of the parent. And that's, I think, and it's all part of the container query spec and everything. So I think like that's fundamentally going to change a little bit how we approach things.
Yeah, that's extremely powerful. And I can see immediately, like my mind jumps to kind of accessibility related stuff like color contrast and things like that, where you see so many websites where like, whether they're content on a carousel or something like that, and then the image changes and then suddenly like the contrast is just awful. And there's so many things that you'd be able to do where it's like, with this big background, change to this, and then with this, do that. So yeah, I was going to say container queries as well. And it just, like you said, in a component-based architecture, not having to worry about necessarily like the size of the screen, you're just worrying about the container. It's like, there's just so many places around Frontend Mentor that we're like, yep, that would be great. As like using container queries, that would be great. That would be great. So yeah, just very, very excited for those to gain a little bit more support and to really come in.
I don't remember what it was at, but it's past 80% now. That's the one cool thing is like now it obviously it gains quickly, and then that like last bit takes longer just because of how it all works. But it's pretty awesome that you can see like all the browsers supporting a relatively new feature so quickly these days.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Another question from the community, and then we'll dive back into the chat as well. Can you ever overuse Flexbox and Grid in your mind? And also, kind of how do you best decide which one to use in a given situation?
Yeah, you definitely can. I've seen star selector display flex, and I was like, oh no, please don't do that.
Yeah.
And even I was talking with someone who'd mentioned that they had actually run into performance issues because they had so many nested display flex items, because display flex for the way that the layout is calculated is dependent on the child. But then if that one is also display flex, so it sort of just creates like this waterfall where the layout is dependent on like 20 levels deep, and then it keeps like sort of coming up. So like, yeah, you could definitely overdo display flex. Grid wouldn't run into that type of issue, but I think if you just threw it everywhere, you're probably not something you necessarily want to do. The main way I decide is a little bit that where Flexbox is more inside out, where Grid is outside in. Or the way I usually say it is what you want to have control on the layout. Do you want the parent to have the control on the layout? Then use Grid. If you want the children to influence the layout, then use Flexbox. It's not like 100% rule, because you can change stuff around. You can make Grid columns look at their children. There's values you can use for our grid columns to make that happen and stuff. So not to say like that's this absolute thing that you have to follow, but I just find that is like a quick, easy rule just to like sort of set the stage. So if I want even columns, and that's the other thing is people often do like, is it 1D versus 2D? The 1D versus 2D is a thing, but it's more about the way Flexbox or grid control the layout. Because with Flexbox, you can have multiple rows and columns, but each column or sorry, each row is independent of the other row. So you don't have a 2D control necessarily, but it's not necessarily, you can still have a 2D layout. So it's just more about the independence of the elements and how you want it to work.
That's a really nice way to look at it. Yeah, that's a very good kind of mental model to have. And sometimes that mental model might be might not quite fit, but it's good as perfect as a base. That's brilliant. Question from the chat about CSS naming. Kind of, what's your guide for naming? You said that you don't really kind of reach for frameworks that rely kind of heavily on names, but what approach do you take?
Yeah, so I've changed a lot, and naming is hard. I think is the first thing. It's one of the reasons that people like Tailwind is because, mind you, I say that, but then I don't find Tailwind solves the problem. It just passes the problem down because you still have to name your component that it's getting applied to, like, right? So like, it doesn't remove naming. It just sort of delegates it to a different part of your what you need to do. And so for me, naming, I used to use BEM really heavily. So if people don't know that, it's block element modifier. It's a very sort of strict way of naming in a sense of just sort of, or organization, I guess. And I was using it really heavily, and it worked for a while. But then the more I was using it, I was like, well, I could just throw a utility class on this instead, and that would make more sense. And then I could do this other thing here instead, and I think that makes more sense. And well, there's nothing wrong with a descendant selector on this, so I'm going to do that here instead. And so I sort of have slowly evolved into a different thing that is definitely influenced from BEM in terms of like having blocks of stuff. But I also use utility classes quite a lot, especially for like font sizes, colors, and other things like that, because you didn't only need to change a font size. You don't want to create a class for that. Just have a utility class that can do it. It's perfect. Once I get to like 3 utility classes in my head, I'm like, well, maybe it's a component now, and I'm just going to give it a class name instead, is sort of how I think about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, naming is definitely difficult. It's one of those things where sometimes, you can go through a couple of days of being fine because whatever you're working on is really clear. It is one thing that's nice with scope styles, but you can do it with descendant selectors as well. Or I was going to say scoped CSS if you're using, Astra or Svelte or Vue or something that has it, where, you're worried less about it. But even just having like, that was the thing with BEM where you'd have like, say the nav is the easy one, where you have your nav. So let's say your class nav, and then inside of there you have a nav list, and then you have your nav links, and then your nav list items, and everything has to be named based on that parent. And it's like, well, it's really, there is the specificity that comes into it, but do I need that, or can I just have a nav class and then say nav space UL and nav space LI and nav space A? And I started doing that, and it worked, and it was fine. And then I'm not having to worry about like longer class names on stuff. And maybe nav doesn't work because then you run into it where I have multiple navs on my page. Well, then you have a primary nav and a secondary nav, or a primary nav and a footer nav or something. And there's you sort of come up with, once you run into those problems, you start adjusting a little bit and getting a little bit more specific with some of the class names that just to prevent issues down the road. But yeah, I sort of have this weird mix of different approaches. And the other thing I've started doing a lot from an accessibility point of view is if there are things related to an element that rely on different ARIA attributes or roles, which the thing for people who don't know too much about ARIA, it's just a way to help screen readers and stuff and assistive technologies know the context of what's going on. Generally speaking, no ARIA is good ARIA, so just use your semantic elements instead. But say you're doing a tab system. Tabs are complicated, and there's nothing native that we have, sadly, right now. So you have to use some ARIA stuff and some roles to make sure everything works properly. So then instead of coming up with class names, I have to use those ARIA roles to make it work. I'm just going to use an attribute selector based on those ARIA roles. And then it means that if ever I'm setting up that component or using it somewhere else, it enforces the proper setup of it from an accessibility point of view, because it only will look that way if it's written well and the JavaScript is making those modifications properly on everything to make it work.
Yeah, I like that. And it's, yeah, kind of tying it to the behavior. And like you said, it's just that prompt, but you're like, why isn't this working? You're like, oh, because I need to do it. So just enforcing those good behaviors.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's great. We have a question. We won't answer this one yet, but I'll just note that we're not skipping over it. We will come back to this because we do have a community question related to that as well. So good reason to stick around to the end of the stream. And next question, Adam, do you have any thoughts on styling web components, working with the shadow DOM, etc.?
Yeah. I feel every time, or for simple things, I think it's fabulous and it's great. I don't have as much experience because I've run into sort of blocks along the way when doing certain things that I've wanted to with web components. And and I think that's why acceptance in general, like it didn't explode in a sense. Like they're there, but they're still kind of a niche topic, though they're gaining momentum a little bit. But yeah, I don't have anything specific just because from a simple point of view, I think it works well. And I don't have enough experience with it to really talk, but there's a few things and I can't think of them off the top of my head because I've sort of put it off to the side, but there's a few things where I run into some issues with them that seem to be sort of just baked into how it works with how the shadow DOM works, and just like sort of the encapsulation that it causes, where it's sort of like, oh, really? You can't do that? And it's a little bit annoying. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Next question. When building a developer portfolio, how can aspiring front-end developers showcase their CSS skills in a way that impresses potential employers?
It's a good question. I think part of it, I guess it depends a little bit. I would say one thing not to do is to try and design and code, because some people are like, well, if I'm writing the CSS, it's so designy, I feel like I have to be doing the design. But don't try and do that. Like use, the nice thing with front-end mentors, you have the design. And it's always a good thing because your stuff is going to look nicer. If you do obviously want something more custom because you're putting in a portfolio or something, you want it to be your own project, heavily go and look at other things and see why they look the way they do, and get ideas from them. I would say the biggest thing is don't overdo it, because especially early on, and I mean, I did the same thing and I still do, and I'm learning new things. You get like all these cool CSS stuff and you want to like put all these CSS effects into something to show how they work. And I see lots of portfolios and stuff where like the animations are just like crazy. Everything seems to be animated with a different animation on it. And I'm just like, oh, that doesn't, like, I think the idea is like you're showing all these things that you can do, but it just makes it a really awkward experience. So you're not making it better. So just like on that front, be a little bit careful. The other thing I have seen on a completely different note was I did a video, it was looking at CSS only games, and one of them was a rock, paper, scissors that was CSS only. And it was the computer did one, you did the other, you'd win or lose. And as I was looking at that, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting one, just because there it's like, there's a lot of people, like it's an early project you do. I've seen tic-tac-toe also that's CSS only. And I've seen some really advanced stuff, but like some of those typical early, portfolio things that people often work on, but with JavaScript, I'm like, if you had one of those that's CSS only, that's kind of more impressive, right? And It's not something that's like real world, but it's like, oh, it's another tic-tac-toe that, somebody's made. And then, like, oh, wait, they did that with only CSS. That's kind of cool. I've seen even limited use calculators and stuff. Like there's some interesting things there if that's sort of the type of thing you want to do, just to have this weird thing that stands out. But yeah, I think that's the only thing I don't know is like if somebody's hiring, how much they actually will look at the CSS you've written, or are they looking more at just like what you've accomplished? Because obviously having well organized, clean, modern CSS is probably what I would be looking for, but
Yep.
I don't know from an employee or employer point of view how much they actually look through that stuff. But I would be ready to talk about it, and have conversation about it, because that also, hopefully you get past just them looking at your portfolio, and then it goes into interviews and being able to talk about
Yep.
that. Even if it doesn't come up, you can steer conversations a little bit too, if it's something that was important for you.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to showcasing projects, we always very strongly recommend kind of a solid README on every repo.
Yep.
We provide a kind of README template for challenges, and we strongly recommend that people kind of, once they've submitted their solution and finished their project, take the time to really go through it, detail what you've learned, detail kind of any approaches that you've taken that are worth talking about, these kind of things. And that having that right there front and center, because a lot of recruiters and hiring managers will be looking through your GitHub repos. They might not dig into the absolute details of your code, but what better way to give them a kind of at a glance run through of the interesting stuff that you're doing than in a well-written README.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no, I think that's some really, really, really great advice. And yeah, with the tic-tac-toe, kind of taking stuff that you would normally have like just functional JavaScript, but like into CSS, and finding different ways, whether it's games or more kind of realistic client type projects, and having a range of those is always going to be a benefit as well. So we've talked so much today about how the landscape of CSS is changing so much. But and I know this is a full-time thing for you, so you've got a bit more time than most people. But how do you kind of stay updated with CSS features and best practices, and kind of what resources do you often look at yourself?
Yeah. So as you said, I cheat a little bit because I just focus on this all day long, so it makes it a lot easier for me. And I also understand why people feel like, holy crap, there's a lot coming. Like, how can I keep up with it? Because I do it all day long and I have trouble keeping up with it. Just yesterday, I was looking up something, and then I was on MDM, and they always have like the related things at the bottom. I'm very good at going down rabbit holes on that. And I found a whole like 4 new things that they were all related, but that I just didn't know about.
Yeah.
I was like, whoa, how did I not know about this? And then so I mean, that is a really good way. It happens less now just because I've spent so much time on MDM that I've gone through a lot of it.
Yeah.
But if I'm researching stuff or looking stuff up, when I'm on the MDM, I always look at that related section at the bottom. And I do a lot of research on stuff. But even if you just end up on MDM and you're looking at how something works, scroll down to the bottom and see what the related stuff going on down there is, because you might just be like, oh, what's that? And it's related to what you're looking at and what you were having a problem with. So you might find something that's exactly what you need. The other thing is I just follow a lot of different resources that sort of share stuff. So there's the CSS Weekly newsletter, which is good because it just is a bunch of sort of a combination of other articles and videos and stuff that are out there. Stephanie Eccles has a newsletter where she shares lots of other resources, which is really good. I follow a lot of people that are involved with the browsers on Twitter or Mastodon, because they're always talking about cutting edge stuff that's often still behind flags or is sort of making its progress forward, and they're making demos and showing stuff. So there's Adam Argyle, Una Kravitz, and Bramis, who are always doing that. They're all on the Chrome team.
Yeah.
What else? I also just look when a browser ships. I always look at the change logs just to see. They always show you what new features have been added. And I've definitely had some where I'm just like, oh, that actually shipped. I've been hearing about this for 2 years and never thought it was going to happen, and there it is.
Yeah.
So, and there too, it could depend. Do you want to see things that are shipping in production? Follow the production ones, but you can also follow like the nightly release, or there's nightly, there's Canary, and the technical preview for Safari. If you look at, keep up to date on just what they're up to, because those are the ones that are shipping the more experimental features before they're even ready. So that's sort of, if you want ideas on what might be coming down in 2 years from now or something, but you can start playing with it. That's sort of some ideas there too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's those some great resources. Yeah, I mean, I'm not on Mastodon, but yeah, Twitter, like I follow well, people like you and like you said, kind of Adam Argyle, great, and Josh Comu,
Yep.
and so just so many people. And yeah, newsletters as well. Always a good way to stay up to date. Junior Garcia is asking, what projects should front end devs have in their portfolio? Saying they've 3 front end mentor projects and 1 zero to mastery. The majority of feedback say projects like front end mentor ones are 2 YouTube follow along type projects to be kind of showcase portfolio.
Yeah, so I think part of it is either, I mean, I think if I'm a recruiter and I've seen the same thing in hundreds of times, then you probably just glaze over to that and don't spend too much attention. But I do think you could take those projects and make them your own. Could be a nice way, just so you're not having to be like, okay, I need a new project from scratch. So whether it's restyling it, whether it's adding on top of it, you have that as your base. You can add new ideas, new things to it, to find sort of twists that you can change to make it your own. Because it's the same. There's, I have lots of, or I don't have as many, but I used to do a lot of like build alongs for just other designs too. And it was the same idea that if you just followed me, then like that's not really a portfolio thing. Whereas, and I think that's the issue is I do have videos on front end mentor projects. So how do they know if you followed me or if you did it completely on your own?
Yeah.
Because I do know some people that are recruiters because I try and talk since I'm out of that thing, but I deal with a lot of beginners. I've been talking to some just to try and get an idea and, being able to follow along and build front end mentor projects is seen as a really good skill, especially when you're basing it on the design system and other stuff, because there's a lot of real world that's going on in there. So I think part of it too is what you'd mentioned about having it in there, but also what you learned and what you did, and how you accomplish things, because that's so important than just like here's the live version on GitHub pages or something like that. There's a big difference there in the context, but finding a personal project and something that you can do on your own, it doesn't, there's no new ideas out there, there's nothing completely unique, but I think you can find something that you could build up from scratch, or as I said, based on one of the ideas from a project that you've already done. I think could be a good way to sort of just put your own twist on things.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's a huge difference between saying I followed Kevin Powell code this on YouTube versus being like I implemented this myself. I problem solved everything. These are some of the decisions that I made. These are the technological choices that I made, and here's everything in a nicely presented README. There's like kind of worlds apart, and I think if you've got a project that either friend or family wants you to build or you want to build and you want to go for it, then that's a great way. If you don't have any of that, and maybe you're not confident in your design skills, and like you said earlier, you do see it a lot where a lot of people come into web development. They're like, "Oh, I need to start learning design now." It's like, no, stick to coding. There's enough to learn just there.
Yeah.
So you don't want to stress yourself out too much as well by thinking like, okay, do I build this portfolio project, but it's not going to look the best, this kind of thing. So definitely front-end mentor projects can work as showcase portfolio pieces, but put your own spin on it. Make sure that you write about your choices and you're ready to talk about kind of some of the technological decisions that you made. But then also if you've got a project that you want to build yourself, then that's absolutely brilliant way to do it as well, for sure. A couple more questions before we finish up. So you now teach developers worldwide through your YouTube channel, which you're coming up on 1 million subscribers, right? You're getting up there. We're nearly at 800,000 registered users, so we're kind of
We're in a
think
bit of
you're
a
a bit
race.
ahead.
Yeah.
And in your experience, kind of what gives you the best chance of success when you see developers going the self-taught route?
I think one thing when you decide you're going the self-taught route is to realize like self-taught is like don't handicap yourself by thinking you need to just like hunker down by yourself and figure everything out on your own. There's so many resources. Before we went live, me and Matt were chatting a little bit about it, like the abundance of resources that are out there right now.
Yeah.
So, you know, take advantage of them as much as possible. There is value, I think, in courses as well, where it's a bit more of a structured sort of like in-depth view versus YouTube videos and other things that are a lot more scattershot. Really depends on your means. I think you could be very successful with either option. The advantage with sort of any sort of course, whatever it is there's just like a structure going from A to B. Whereas if you're doing it sort of the true self-taught way, where you're just sort of scrambling to find resources, that's how I did a lot of it, and it took me a long time. The other thing I will say, and I know a lot of people have trouble finding the time or they don't want to do it, but whether it's starting a blog or making videos or anything, but where you try and, it doesn't even have to be teach, just explain what you're learning. It could even just be every time you finish a project, have that README file, but explain different things that you did in there. Like some key things, but talk about like how they worked and like, why did I decide that, but how did they work or whatever it is. Because I know for me, and I know everybody else who teaches in anything or who writes blog posts, whatever it is, the amount of the amount of connections, the amount of learning you do through trying to explain something is crazy. And it sounds really silly, but like I used to teach in the classroom and I'd be standing in front of the class teaching something. And as I was saying it out loud, I'd have like an aha moment of being like, oh, that's why. And it'd be related, but maybe not directly to the sentence I was saying, but I'd make this new connection to something that I never even realized before as I'm standing up teaching people about it. And so like, it's this really strange thing. And it's the same if you're writing. Because as you're writing, trying to explain something, because knowing how to do something and be able to explain it are really different. You just get this much deeper knowledge of something. So I know some people don't want to go public. I don't even think it has to be public. You can write all of these yourself, whatever it is, but just trying to explain things goes a really long way in having a deeper understanding of things. And I think that the depth of understanding is so important because we rush through things, and I catch myself doing it too when I'm learning new stuff. I just want to be able to get it to work, and then like who cares how it works? Just how do I figure out? I need this to work. But if you're in the learning side and not the ship it side of things, giving yourself the time to have a depth to your learning is so important, I think. And don't be afraid to go backwards a little bit, because especially early on when you're learning, I mean, CSS is what I know, so I'll relate to that, where you're learning the syntax, you're learning all of these new properties and values. And early on, there's lots and lots and lots of properties and values. And you're learning the box model and specificity and the cascade and inheritance and all of these other fundamental things. But you learn about them in terms of like, okay, I know they exist, but you're so focused on like these 500 new properties and values that I need to learn. That's where most of your like cognitive attention is going. And so at one point, like taking a step back, okay, I've sort of got that down. I'm pretty comfortable with where I'm at now. Sometimes instead of moving forward, just doing a little look back on some of the stuff that you've looked at can actually really help as well. Just because then you'll sort of be like, oh, okay, I get why they were talking about that thing now that I actually have time to think about it a little bit. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's often a kind of a desire to get that kind of 100% complete on this module, 100% complete on this module, and you just keep going and going and going. But yeah, taking a little bit longer and really, and like you said, revisiting content could be so powerful. Do you have time for one more question?
Of course.
All good, amazing. This is the big one from Cameron earlier, and it's from the community as well. And you recently, it was just over a week ago, wasn't it? You sent out a newsletter, kind of saying, is it so is it time to worry about AI or something like that was the subject, and talking about this kind of stuff. What are your thoughts on AI tools, and where do you see the future of web development heading?
Yeah,
big question.
So yeah, I think right now they're a productivity tool, just like a lot of other things that we've had along the way. And I think they're going to be at that stage for a long time still. I know it's very like circular. It seems to be very common in this space for whatever reason, that we seem to get like a new model comes out and then everyone panics, and then sort of we realize, oh, okay, it's okay at these things, and then it sort of fades off, and then a new model comes out and then everybody panics again, and then it fades off. And it seems to sort of be this recurring cycle that's happening with that. But I think at least for quite a while, there's a long way to go before it's actually something we need to think about in terms of like it's able to do things that we can. I think it's good. Use it. Use the tools we have. I make stupid mistakes in my own CSS, and then it finds my repeated property for me, or to find a missing semicolon on something or whatever it is, like these stupid things that we do. It's really good at finding stuff like that. I've had it improve accent. I didn't prompt it for that, but I gave it something with a JavaScript function I was sort of not happy with, and it sort of fixed one thing that wasn't working, but it also changed some of the naming that I used, and it was much better. So I was like, oh, that's cool. I'll definitely, that was a nice little bonus there. Nice. So I think it's definitely something that we can use that can improve and help us out and make us just a bit more efficient. But in terms of being worried about anything, I'm not convinced at all right now. I think that I guess part of it depends on what you're using it for. But even, I mean, the big one now was Devin, that was making the rounds. And to me, it was a really good marketing, because it's just like, oh, look, it's opening a web browser, and oh, it's opening a terminal. And that's the only reason you would show that, is because it looks good as a marketing thing. Because like the AI doesn't need to open Google to Google something. It can access Stack Overflow, and it's been doing it already without having to like open the browser on the side and then open the terminal. Yeah. And getting errors from the terminal was kind of cool, but I was also like, well, you're showing me a demo instead of actually like having this. And then the thing that really got me on that one was they gave the results. I guess for me, one of the things with AI is some of the tools are marketed as productivity tools, and some of them are marketed as this is this new thing that's going to be able to take over. And that's what Devin was. Here's a AI software engineer. Yeah. But they gave it, and I forget the name of the thing, but there's like the open source problems that they have AIs that can sort of go through, and then it sees how many of the open source problems out of a random sampling that it can solve on its own without any assistance. And they mentioned it because it was a big improvement over the previous best, but the previous best was 5%, and this one was around 13%. Yep. And that's a huge improvement. It's probably worth saying, look how much better this is, because that's a really impressive number to be up by. But it's not if you had a software engineer working in a company that could only solve 13% of the tasks that were given to him, he's not going to keep his job for too long. Yeah. Right. So is it something that will probably be able to help us out? Yeah, I think so. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if we don't hear about Devin too much going forward. Just because I see it as such a marketing push, and I think other tools will sort of come up. I have a feeling we'll never hear it do its news cycle and then go off into the distance. Maybe I'm wrong though. But I also think like when you're looking at it going, it can solve say 13% or 15 or whatever it was at. If it can solve that many things on its own right now, we're still in like the lowest of the low hanging fruit of the problems that it's able to solve. Until we hit 50%, like the gains we're going to be seeing for the next year or 2 years are going to be a lot, because we're just doing low hanging fruit still. And it hasn't actually got into the more complicated stuff. And that's where the gains start slowing down, and they exponentially slow down. We've seen it with self-driving cars. We've seen it with other things. The closer you get to the end, the longer it takes to get that next 1%. Yeah. And the other thing that I always say to people is if you're worried about it becoming a software engineer, it's not about, do you need a new job? Because if it could do what we do, it can do a lot of other stuff too. So it's not like it's only going to impact our industry, if and when, depending on you see it. But if AI gets to the point where it's able to replace what we do completely, I think that it's going to have a very big impact across most sectors. And in the meantime, as it becomes this tool that does increase efficiency, it's the one thing, like if everybody's much more efficient, maybe you don't need as many jobs, but like most things, it probably just creates other new stuff that we haven't thought about yet.
Yeah.
We've seen it happen in history before as other things come in and automate tasks and make things easier. It's not all of a sudden everybody's unemployed. It's just there's new positions and new things and new stuff that people are doing. It could disrupt, it could cause some stuff along the way, but long term, I'm not too concerned about it.
Yeah, it's I've got a lot of thoughts on it, and I won't bore you with them. But it's, I mean, it's useful for so many things, and like you said, productivity boosts. Like one of the things I mentioned earlier was the fact that we're experimenting with reworking our styling using Tailwind, because the architecture that we're using, the upgrades to Next, it kind of moves itself towards like Tailwind being a good thing to use. And actually, GitHub Copilot is seriously helping with that refactor. It's kind of Josh who's doing it is just like, yeah, this is saving a huge amount of time. And so for those kind of things, writing unit tests, for helping, like find bugs in your code or misspellings or anything like that, it's absolutely great. And no doubt it will improve our workflow. But yeah, when you get to the abstraction layer of this is going to create this entire system in a good way. I mean, it's still writing code, so, and you're going to be able to then like debug all of those tiny little bits, like the problems that it solves just by using written English. That's when it starts to get to like, yeah, okay, that feels like a bit of a stretch at the moment. You never know technological advances, but it was a good marketing video. And I've seen, I watched it and looked at some of the reaction videos of people like Theo and stuff on YouTube, and he did a really good dissection of it as well, and looking at the timestamps and all of this kind of thing. And it's like, it was a very good marketing tool, and it's got us all talking about it, which is so hats off to them for that. But as far as actually replacing engineers with AI, that's, yeah. I don't buy it. So yeah. That's amazing. So there are a couple more questions in the chat that we don't have time to get to, unfortunately. So I'm really sorry if we didn't manage to get to your questions today. But I hope that you all found this very, very useful. And I just want to thank you once again, Kevin, for coming here today, sharing your knowledge. There's absolute gold dust, lots and lots of information for people to dig into and watch over and over again, and help them in their learning journey. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was fun. It was a good conversation. I appreciate it.
Amazing. All right, well, take care, everyone, and see you in the Discord. Take care.